Even though the Roman Empire was built through military power, some Roman writers expressed strong negative opinions about soldiers. For example, the poet Juvenal sharply criticized soldiers and the special rights they had under the law. Other writers, like Tacitus and several authors from the later Roman period, also complained about how soldiers behaved rudely or unfairly toward ordinary people. These views suggest that soldiers were often seen as different from the rest of society. In the early Republic, this wasn't really an issue because most soldiers were part-time. They farmed their land and only went to war during the campaign season each year. But over time, especially during the civil wars of the 1st century BC, soldiers started serving for longer periods without returning home. The biggest change came with Emperor Augustus. He created a full-time professional army, which made being a soldier a long-term job, not just something men did for a short while. Although all Roman citizens still had the duty to serve if needed, in reality, only a small group of people became career soldiers. These men spent many years, even decades, in the army. For them, being a soldier was a central part of who they were. This change led to a new word, pagani, meaning civilians who were not in the army. We also see this shift in the appearance of military tombstones starting in Augustus's time. These memorials were often placed in or near army camps, showing that they were mainly meant to be seen by other soldiers, not by the general public. When Augustus created the new system of full-time military service, it made soldiers feel more separate from the rest of Roman society. He reinforced this separation in several ways. For example, soldiers were given their own seating areas at public shows in Rome and Italy. But a more important change was that Augustus moved the legions out of Italy and placed them in permanent camps along the empire's borders. This physical distance between soldiers and civilians made the separation more real. Augustus also gave soldiers special rights that made them stand out as a group. One major change was that soldiers no longer had to obey their fathers when it came to spending their military pay or property they earned while serving. This was a big deal because Roman law usually gave the father strong control over his son's property. Later, emperors gave even more legal freedoms to soldiers, especially when it came to writing wills. Soldiers didn't have to follow the strict rules that other citizens did, which made it easier for them to decide who would get their belongings when they died. Another advantage was in the legal system. If a soldier had a dispute with a civilian, he could have the case heard by a military officer in the army camp instead of a regular court. This often gave soldiers an edge, and some writers, like Juvenal, made fun of this in their works. However, not all differences were in the soldiers' favor. Augustus also made it illegal for soldiers to marry while they were in service. This law didn't stop soldiers from living with partners or having children, but those relationships weren't legally recognized. That meant it was difficult for soldiers to leave their property to their partners or children. In 119, the Emperor Hadrian made a helpful change. He allowed children of soldiers to inherit some of their father's property, even though they still couldn't be named as the main heirs. The rule that banned Roman soldiers from getting married stayed in place until at least the late 2nd century. Many believe that Emperor Septimius Severus removed the ban around the year 197 to win the support of the army after a civil war. However, the historical evidence isn't completely clear, and a recently found inscription suggests that the marriage ban might have still existed in the early 3rd century. The first clear proof of a legally married soldier doesn't appear until 294, so the exact date when the ban ended is unknown. Still, this restriction lasted for more than 200 years and played an important role in making soldiers feel like a separate group in society. Besides this rule, there were also other parts of army life that made soldiers feel different from civilians, and helped them see themselves as part of a close-knit military community. One ancient author even described the army camp as a soldier's second homeland, and his tent as his home and hearth. This feeling of belonging began when a new soldier joined the army and swore an oath of loyalty. This oath, called a sacramentum, was repeated every year and reminded soldiers of their duty and identity. It also had religious meaning, as some veterans made offerings to the spirit. A soldier's identity in the army was also shaped by the groups he served in. He started with his tent mates, the small group of soldiers he lived, ate, and fought with. Then he belonged to a larger unit like a century for infantry or a turma for cavalry, and then to a cohort, legion, or cavalry wing. Soldiers often made dedications to the spirits of these groups, showing how important they were to their sense of identity. All these layers gave soldiers many ways to see themselves as part of something larger. Not just individuals, but members of a strong, united military brotherhood. In the Roman army, military units built a strong group identity, and one key way this was done was through the use of standards, special flags or symbols that represented each group. These standards were very important, and the soldiers who carried them held high status. Besides the famous eagle of the legions, there were also unique standards for smaller units like cohorts and centuries. These standards weren't just symbols, they were treated with deep respect, almost like religious objects. For example, the anniversary of a legion was celebrated as the birthday of the eagle, and when not in use, the standards were stored in a special shrine at the center of the military camp, along with the soldiers' savings. Losing a standard in battle was seen as a huge disgrace, and soldiers would fight hard to protect them. That's why it was such a big deal when Augustus recovered Roman standards from the Parthians in 20 BC. Most of this information comes from the time of the Principate. But even as the Roman military changed during the 3rd century and Christianity spread through the empire, some traditions stayed the same. For instance, soldiers still had to take a military oath when joining the army, and now the oath included a mention of the Christian Trinity. Standards also remained important. They still appeared in stories, military texts, and inscriptions. Losing them was still shameful, and getting them back was still worth celebrating. Emperor Constantine made this connection to religion even stronger by introducing the Labarum, a new kind of standard decorated with Christian symbols. Later, in the 6th century, military manuals even instructed commanders to bless the standards before going into battle. So even though the Roman army changed a lot over time, the shared symbols and rituals that helped build soldier identity remained powerful. Not all the things that made Roman soldiers feel like part of a group came from official rules or army organization. Some were more personal and community-based. One example is the small clubs that existed within the army, called collegia or scholae. These weren't for regular soldiers, but for those with special jobs or higher ranks. Most of what we know about these clubs comes from inscriptions, so we don't know everything about how they worked. But it seems they acted partly as social groups, partly as savings or support clubs for things like retirement or funerals. They sometimes had their own meeting places, and each club had a special guardian spirit or genius that the members would honor. The clubs also showed their loyalty to the emperor, which probably helped them gain official approval. But for the members themselves, the most important part was probably the friendship and unity they felt with others doing the same job. They even called each other brothers, as if they were a family. Religious activities also helped build this sense of community. For example, there's a record from the year 227 where 21 soldiers from the Praetorian Guard, who all came from the same city in Thrace, made a religious dedication together in Rome to a local Thracian god. Even when soldiers no longer lived in or had much contact with the place they originally came from, They sometimes kept up religious traditions from that place. This helped them stay connected as a group. There were also other shared religious practices that didn't come from the army or from specific places, but still gave soldiers a sense of belonging. All of these things, clubs, local religion, shared rituals, helped soldiers see themselves as part of a separate world from civilians. In the end, the identity of a Roman soldier wasn't just one thing. It was made up of many layers: official duty, friendships, shared beliefs, and even how they related to civilians. Understanding a soldier's life means seeing all these different parts working together. During the Principate period, it's easy to think that Roman soldiers lived totally separate lives from civilians. Soldiers had special legal rights, used their own slang, and followed unique customs. Because of this, some historians have described the Roman army as a closed society, or even a total institution. This idea comes from sociology and describes a place where many people live and work together, cut off from normal society under strict rules, like a prison or a military camp. Some scholars used this model to describe Roman soldiers in regions like Numidia, arguing that troops there were brought in from other areas, mostly stayed within the army community, and even formed relationships only within that group. This made it seem like the army was not part of the local population at all, but was instead a tool of the central government used to control provinces by force. Evidence from places like the fortress at Dura Europos in the east seemed to support this idea. However, other studies tell a different story. For example, research from Roman Egypt, especially from a group of military records known as the Abyneus Archive, shows that soldiers often came from the local population and had regular contact with civilians. This evidence suggests that in Egypt, at least, the army was better integrated with society. A similar pattern is seen in the cemeteries of Roman Mainz, where civilians and soldiers were buried together more and more often over time. Some historians also challenged the idea of the army as a totally separate institution by pointing out that many military religious ceremonies included civilians. So, while the Roman army did have some characteristics of a closed community, in many places it was actually connected to the wider society. In the next section, the role of religion in these relationships will be explored further, but here the focus is on other aspects of daily life in the Roman military. Roman military camps were never made up of just soldiers. Even in the Middle Republican period, soldiers were often accompanied by non-combatants such as servants, helpers, or slaves. These people were sometimes called camp followers or soldiers' servants, and while they usually didn't fight, in emergencies they might have had to. Slaves were common among Roman soldiers because they were often taken as part of the spoils of war. These slaves had many duties, like collecting firewood, cooking, taking care of animals, or even offering sexual services. Some of them helped with horses and pack animals, which were essential for moving supplies and running the camp. Because of their important roles, historians have wondered whether some of them might have been hired or owned by the state, rather than individual soldiers. Either way, these people were closely tied to military life and aren't always considered part of general soldier-civilian relations. There were also other non-combatants around the camps who had more temporary or less connected roles, like entertainers, dancers, singers, and prostitutes. These people would come and go, but still had frequent contact with soldiers. A famous example comes from the siege of Numantia in Spain in the 130 BC, where there were reportedly 2,000 prostitutes across the Roman camps. In Roman Egypt, we find even more detailed records from the 2nd century. In letters found near the Red Sea, it seems that prostitution was privately arranged, not managed by the army, and women would be contracted to groups of soldiers for a month at a time. Merchants were another important group found in and around military camps. As soldiers began earning regular pay and living more settled lives, they became ideal customers for traders. Soldiers also sold off goods they had collected during campaigns, including slaves, creating a natural relationship between soldiers and merchants. Although this economic interaction isn't always well recorded, it clearly existed. While these examples of entertainers, prostitutes, and merchants show how civilians interacted with soldiers, these relationships were often short-term. For more long-lasting and meaningful connections between the army and local communities, we have to look at things like recruitment from local populations, marriages, and shared religious practices. When it comes to recruitment, one important detail is that in North Africa, most soldiers didn't come from the nearby areas where they were stationed. Instead, they were often recruited from cities on the coast, far from the army camps. This made soldiers feel more separate from the local communities. This is different from what we usually expect during the Roman Empire, where more and more soldiers were thought to come from the local areas near their bases. Still, the word local can mean different things, so it's not always easy to define. In other parts of the empire, especially places like Pannonia, recruitment did become more local. In the eastern provinces like Syria and Arabia, evidence shows that over time, both regular legions and auxiliary units started recruiting more from nearby populations. Even if these recruits weren't from the exact towns near the camps, many of them spoke Greek, which helped communication between soldiers and civilians. Later on, in late antiquity, things became more complicated. Some army units moved around a lot, especially in the 3rd and 4th centuries, so they didn't always serve near where they came from. For example, a soldier named Aurelius Gaius served all over the empire during the reign of Diocletian. In other cases, it was a strategic decision to move soldiers far from home. For instance, troops from Isauria, a region in Anatolia, were sent to Egypt because their home region had a reputation for rebellion. But not all soldiers liked being moved. In 360, when the Emperor Constantius II ordered Julian to send troops from Gaul to the east, many of those troops refused. They didn't want to leave their homeland, partly because some of them had been promised they wouldn't be sent far away. These included both local men and barbarian recruits who had settled in Gaul. Similarly, in Egypt, many soldiers were recruited locally. Even if a unit originally came from somewhere else, over time it would usually be filled with local men within a few generations. During the early Roman Empire, soldiers were not allowed to have legal marriages. Still, many of them lived with women in relationships that were like marriage. For a long time, people believed that these unofficial wives usually lived in civilian areas next to military camps and were mostly local women from nearby communities. But recent studies have challenged these assumptions. Archaeological work inside military camps has uncovered items that likely belonged to women and children, such as hairpins, small shoes, and jewelry, as well as children's skeletons. This shows that women and children actually lived inside the camps, not just outside them. Also, new research on inscriptions, especially from documents called auxiliary diplomas, shows that many of the women soldiers lived with were not local. In fact, about half of them seem to have come from the soldiers' home regions. Some women were even daughters or sisters of other soldiers, showing that relationships often formed within the military community itself. Only about 1/3 of these relationships were actually with local women, which is less than previously thought. In North Africa especially, it looks like most soldiers had relationships with women from within the army community, not with locals. So we now know that marriage patterns were more complex and varied by region. In some areas, soldiers did build stronger local connections, while in others, Like North Africa, they stayed more separate from the civilian population. Later, in late antiquity, the rules changed and soldiers were allowed to marry legally. But by that time, fewer inscriptions were being made, so we have less evidence. We know that soldiers still often married the daughters of other soldiers, but there is also clear evidence that they married local women too. For example, after the Roman Empire took back North Africa in 533, many soldiers married women from the defeated Vandal population. However, because of limited records, it's hard to know how common each type of marriage really was. The main point is that marriage and relationships in the Roman army were diverse and often depended on the region. Roman soldiers didn't just fight battles, they also had many interactions with regular civilians as part of their daily duties. Sometimes these interactions were negative. Throughout Roman history, there are many examples of soldiers using their power to take advantage of civilians. One common abuse was taking people's animals, carts, food, and even homes, especially while traveling. Although the army was sometimes officially allowed to use local resources, soldiers often went beyond what they were permitted. In places like Thrace, Anatolia, and Egypt, we have clear evidence that soldiers sometimes forced civilians to give them things they weren't supposed to. Even emperors tried to stop this behavior with laws, but it was hard to control. This problem had existed since the late Republic, but it became worse after Augustus created a permanent army. That army needed regular supplies and transport, which gave soldiers even more chances to exploit local communities. In late antiquity, soldiers were often paid with goods instead of money, and many units were based in towns and cities, so the pressure on civilians grew. One letter from Egypt even describes soldiers being forced into people's homes without warning and treating the homeowners badly. In the 6th century, things got really bad in Edessa, where soldiers kicked people out of their houses, stole food and clothing, and even committed acts of violence, including rape. The locals said that the soldiers acted more like enemies than protectors. However, it's important to remember that most of the serious complaints were about soldiers who were just passing through, not those who lived in the community long term. And there are also examples of soldiers helping civilians. In Roman Egypt, people often sent letters to local army officers asking for help with problems like theft or family disputes. The fact that so many of these letters have survived shows that civilians trusted soldiers enough to turn to them for help. In other parts of the empire, like Anatolia, some soldiers were even honored by local communities. One village asked for a soldier to be sent to help solve a dispute, and in Aphrodisias, 2 soldiers were given statues by the city to thank them for acting with kindness and fairness. So while soldiers could sometimes abuse their power, they also played positive roles in civilian life, depending on the situation. In 4th century Egypt, we can see that military officers still played an important role in local communities. One of the best examples is Abenaeus, a cavalry commander stationed at the fort of Dionysius in the 340s. While some people did complain to him about bad behavior by the soldiers under his command, others asked for his help in dealing with criminals who were not part of the army. This shows that civilians still saw army officers as people who could offer protection and help, just like in earlier centuries. Elsewhere, there are signs that not all interactions between civilians and soldiers were negative. For instance, in Italy in the late 4th century, a man who had once hosted a soldier later arranged and paid for that soldier's grave, even calling himself the soldier's heir. This suggests that hosting soldiers didn't always lead to problems. Sometimes it created lasting bonds. In 6th century Egypt and Palestine, we also find evidence of soldiers taking part in everyday legal transactions with civilians, showing that they were involved in local life. Even in Edessa, where some soldiers were known to behave terribly in 505 to 506, Sources also mention that others lived peacefully. A few years earlier, when an epidemic struck the city, Roman soldiers helped care for the sick and even paid the costs of treatment. All of this tells us that military-civilian relations across the empire were not simple. In some places, soldiers and civilians lived very separate lives and didn't trust each other. But in other places, they worked together and built positive relationships. So we shouldn't make general statements about Roman soldiers always being distant or hostile to civilians. The reality was much more complex. During the Roman Republic, religious rituals related to war were mostly performed by commanders or officials, not ordinary soldiers. Sometimes commanders would purify their troops through rituals, likely involving animal sacrifices, and then give speeches afterward. Soldiers could watch these events, but they didn't usually take part in them. They also joined in victory parades called triumphs, which ended with sacrifices to Jupiter. However, not every general had a triumph, and space was limited where the ceremony happened, so the soldiers' involvement was often minimal. In earlier times, Roman military standards had animal symbols like eagles, wolves, or horses. These may have had spiritual meanings, but it's unclear if any rituals were tied to them during the Republic. Since the army back then was made up mostly of Roman citizens and their Italian allies, their religious customs came from Italy, even though some foreign religions, like the cults of Cybele or Bacchus, had started to spread into Rome by the late Republic. Everything changed when Augustus created a permanent, standing army. This allowed for a regular religious calendar in army camps, which helped build loyalty to the emperor. Soldiers now had yearly religious events that honored both the traditional Roman gods and the emperors. One of the best examples of this is a papyrus found in Dura Europos, a Roman fortress on the empire's eastern border. This document, known as the Feriale Durinum, shows a full calendar of official army religious holidays from the 230s AD. The calendar focused only on traditional Roman religion and honoring the emperor. There was no mention of other religious beliefs. It likely came from an older version set up by Augustus. It's not clear if army units had official priests, though we do know there were soldiers who helped with sacrifices, called victimari. Some sources mention priests in the military, but the evidence is unclear, and commanders could perform the rituals themselves. So, while religion became a bigger part of army life under Augustus, how it was managed within each unit is still partly unknown. During the Principate, most Roman military units were based far from Italy, in places where traditional Roman gods were not well known by the local people. Because of this, the religious calendar followed by the soldiers, which focused on Roman gods and emperors, likely made them feel more separate from the communities nearby. Even many soldiers who were born in the provinces wouldn't have been familiar with these Roman deities at first. In older research, this sense of separation was also linked to the soldiers' involvement in unofficial religious cults, especially the cult of Mithras and the cult of Jupiter Dolithinus. Mithras was originally an Indo-Iranian god connected to sun worship. In the Roman Empire, his cult became popular in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. It was an all-male religion with secret levels of membership, and for a long time, it was believed that Mithraism especially appealed to soldiers and spread mainly through the army. However, newer research shows that this idea was based on limited evidence. In fact, merchants and travelers may have done more to spread the cult. While some soldiers were definitely followers of Mithras, less than 20% of known followers in inscriptions were soldiers, except in heavily militarized areas like Britain and Numidia. Also, most soldier followers had some rank in the army, like centurions or standard-bearers. Regular low-ranking soldiers were rarely involved. For these mid-level officers, the cult gave a sense of shared identity and status through its teachings and group meals. Only in places like Numidia and Britain does Mithraism really seem like a military cult that may have kept soldiers apart from civilians. Jupiter Dolicanus was a storm god from Syria, whose worship spread west in the 2nd century. Although we know little about what the religion taught, about half of the dedications found have links to the military. This led some scholars to call it a military cult, but newer studies show that civilians were also interested in it. More recently, researchers have argued that while the cult spread through military networks, many of the civilian followers were people who had regular contact with soldiers. So, while the military helped spread this religion, it wasn't only for them. The relationship between soldiers and civilians played an important role in the cult's popularity. During the Principate, Roman soldiers were not only involved in official military or state cults like those of Mithras or Jupiter Dolicanus. In many parts of the empire, they also took part in local religious traditions. This shows that they sometimes interacted with nearby civilian communities, at least in religious settings. For example, in the eastern provinces, soldiers made offerings to local gods like Atargatis, Jupiter Heliopolitanus, and Zeus Bytotesius in the same temples used by civilians. In Egypt, soldiers and civilians both left graffiti in temples asking local gods for protection. In North Africa, especially around the fort at Bounjem, soldiers worshipped local gods such as Jupiter Hammon and Mars Canaphar. Similarly, in Numidia, many soldiers from the Lambasis army camp followed the local Saturn cult. Along the lower Rhine, soldiers made dedications to local female deities called the Matronae Auphaniae. These religious acts show that soldiers wanted the protection of local gods, and although this doesn't directly prove that they mixed with civilians during worship, it strongly suggests shared religious spaces and possible contact. There's also the interesting case of Christianity. In the fortress of Dura Europos on the Euphrates, a Christian house church was discovered that might have been visited by both civilians and soldiers. While the church was outside the military zone, and no clear signs of soldier presence were found inside it, we do know that soldiers did enter other religious places in the city. Though Christians were occasionally persecuted by Roman authorities during the Principate, these events were rare and usually limited to certain areas. The first empire-wide persecution didn't happen until 249 under Emperor Decius. So, for most of this period, there wasn't much preventing Christian soldiers from going to church, if they were Christian. Some people have wondered how Christian soldiers could serve in the army, since military life required taking part in official Roman religious rituals. But it's likely that some soldiers became Christian after joining, and others may have quietly avoided deep involvement in the rituals. By the late 3rd century, enough Christians were in the army for Emperor Diocletian to worry about it. He even ordered that Christian soldiers be removed before launching his larger persecution. Still, this suggests that Christians were present in the military without yet being large enough in number to threaten its function. Overall, these examples show that religion sometimes created connections, not just divisions, between soldiers and the people living near them. The most important question about Christianity and the Roman army is how quickly the army became Christian once Christian emperors came to power. Just 10 years after Emperor Diocletian started his persecution of Christians in 303, Constantine became ruler in the western part of the empire and began supporting the Christian church around 312. Although the church had many different theological views, the overall direction of imperial policy in the 4th century favored Christianity. Still, traditional Roman religious practices weren't completely banned until later in the century. One major exception was Emperor Julian, who tried to bring back paganism. His short reign showed that even though soldiers had accepted Christian emperors before, it didn't mean they had all fully converted to Christianity, since there wasn't a strong backlash when Julian brought back the old traditions. Only a small number of soldiers were removed from the army for refusing to take part in pagan rituals. Later, the losses in Julian's failed Persian campaign and at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 left the army short of men. This made it harder for later Christian emperors to force religious changes in the army. Still, Emperor Theodosius I banned pagan sacrifices in the early 3900s, which must have slowly changed the religious life of the army. Around this time, a Christian part was added to the army's oath of loyalty, and by the 430s, there were Christian priests, chaplains, serving with military units. Since most soldiers came from the countryside, where people were slower to accept Christianity, army life may have actually helped spread the religion. By the 6th century, Christian practices had become normal in the army. Soldiers were expected to fast before Easter, and generals would use Christian images to encourage their troops before battle. A military manual from the end of the 6th century even describes a routine for soldiers that included regular prayers and church attendance. By then, the old Roman religious calendar used in the army had been completely replaced by Christian practices. At first, it might seem strange to say that war could help different cultures mix and learn from each other. But when we look at the history of warfare in the Roman world, we see that this actually happened a lot. Other states admired Rome's military power and often tried to copy its army and organization. But what's even more interesting is that the Romans themselves often borrowed ideas and techniques from their enemies. This habit of learning from others helped Rome become such a strong military power, and some Roman writers even pointed this out later. One early example of copying Roman ways comes from Antiochus IV, a king of the Seleucid Empire. In 166 BC, he showed off an army that included 5,000 soldiers trained and dressed like Romans. These troops were not just for show. They later fought in real battles. It made sense, since Rome had recently beaten Antiochus III and the Macedonians in major battles, proving Roman military strength. Around this same time, the Ptolemies in Egypt also made changes to their armies based on Roman ideas. In the 1st century BC, Eastern rulers like Mithridates of Pontus and Tigranes of Armenia used Roman-style troops against the Romans themselves. Diodorus of Galatia also trained his army like the Romans, not to fight Rome, but to ally with it. His army later became the foundation of the Roman unit called Legio Deiotarriana. Even in distant Iran, mail armor and helmet styles began to reflect Roman influence, and some Germanic tribes started using Roman tactics, like having reserves and better leadership structures. Ironically, one thing others copied from Rome, mail armor, was originally something the Romans had borrowed from the Celts centuries earlier. This shows how Rome's military success came from constantly learning and adapting. Greek writers even noticed this. One famous example is when the Romans, during the First Punic War, built their first fleet of warships based on a Carthaginian ship they had captured. Another big example is the Roman use of the Spanish sword, known for its sharp point and strength. After fighting the Spanish troops serving under Hannibal, the Romans stopped using their old swords and switched to this new design, which suited their close combat fighting style and was much stronger and more reliable in battle. Over time, the swords used by Roman soldiers changed in size and shape. In the 1st century AD, swords became shorter, but by the end of the 2nd century, they grew longer again. These changes weren't about copying enemy weapons, but about adapting Roman fighting techniques to better handle the enemies they were facing. The shorter swords and curved rectangular shields helped Roman soldiers fight more effectively in close combat, especially against tough enemies like the Germanic tribes. Later, when horse-riding enemies became more common and dangerous, longer swords and oval shields became more useful for countering mounted attacks. But the Romans didn't just adjust their tactics. They also borrowed equipment ideas from other cultures, especially from the steppe warriors of Central Asia, like the Sarmatians and the Parthians. Some of these influences show up in small details, like sword handles made from metal rings instead of wood, new ways to attach scabbards, and redesigned horse gear. One of the biggest changes, though, was the creation of heavy cavalry units called conteri, named after the long spears they used, called contus. These cavalry soldiers often used two-handed lances and wore full body armor. Units like these started appearing in the 2nd century, and by the 4th century, they had become an important part of the Roman army. Some of these troops were actually Sarmatians, brought into the Roman army for their riding skills, but many were recruited from different parts of the empire. Although some people have questioned how effective this heavy cavalry really was, the fact that they stayed in use until at least the 6th century shows that Roman commanders considered them valuable. In the Roman Empire, archery became more important over time, especially thanks to influences from the East. At first, many of the best archers came from places like Parthia and other Eastern cultures that were already skilled in using bows. These archers often served in Roman auxiliary units and used special composite bows, which were strong and powerful. Over time, these bows became more common in the Roman army, as archers from other parts of the empire also started using them. Later, when the Romans encountered steppe peoples like the Huns and Avars, they learned even more. The Huns, in particular, introduced stronger bows and better saddles that made horseback archery easier. Roman cavalry tactics changed to reflect this, and mounted archers played an important role in Roman victories, especially in the time of the historian Procopius. The Avars also brought new ideas, including the metal stirrup, which came from Central Asia. Even though the Romans already had good saddles, the stirrup helped soldiers stay more stable while shooting arrows from horseback. However, Rome didn't always copy everything from its enemies. Some people used to think the Roman army became too barbarian in late antiquity, especially because many soldiers and commanders came from Germanic backgrounds. They pointed to formations with Germanic names, like the Shield Wall and the Drungus Cavalry. But recent research shows that these were not really new formations, but just new names for old Roman tactics. So, the Roman military didn't completely change or lose its identity. Why did the Romans adopt so many ideas from others? Partly because, like in all of military history, when something works well, others copy it. Also, the Roman Empire was huge, and controlling such a big area meant encountering many cultures with different ways of fighting. Roman soldiers often took weapons and armor as loot, which gave them a chance to study and sometimes copy enemy technology. But what's really interesting is that Romans borrowed more from others than others borrowed from them. This was especially true with groups like the Sarmatians and Parthians, who were excellent horsemen. Rome didn't have much to teach them in that area, but it learned a lot from them. Romans were also more open than many ancient societies. They were willing to give citizenship to outsiders and even freed slaves, and this inclusive attitude may have helped them accept new military ideas too. Some say this openness goes back to Roman founding stories, which talk about welcoming outsiders. Whatever the reason, this Roman ability to learn from others was a big part of why their army was so successful. The connection between Roman culture and the army has often been explained using the idea of Romanization. This meant either soldiers from different backgrounds becoming more Roman during their service, or the local people near army bases adopting Roman ways because of contact with the military. However, the term Romanization has become more controversial over time. People have started to question whether it really reflects what happened, because it suggests that the Romans were always in control, spreading a single, unified culture. In reality, as Rome conquered more lands, first in Italy during the Republic and later across a huge empire, it also absorbed many different peoples, each with their own cultures. These people didn't just accept Roman identity, they helped shape it. As a result, what it meant to be Roman varied from place to place. This change was also seen in the army. During the Republic, many Italian soldiers joined the army. Later, during the Principate and late antiquity, more and more provincial soldiers served. Over time, the cultural mix in the army became more complex. So we can't just think of the Roman army as a tool for spreading Roman culture in a simple, one-way process. The reality was much more complicated. Different parts of the empire had different experiences, and it's hard to generalize. Still, there were some consistent things across the Roman military. One clear example is the use of Latin. Latin remained the main language of the army, especially for official documents, commands, and training, all the way into late antiquity. While many soldiers spoke other languages in their daily lives, Latin was the language of power in military life. Even if some soldiers didn't speak it well, Latin helped unite people in the army and had a strong influence outside the army too. In fact, the Roman military played a major role in spreading Latin to Greek-speaking areas and other parts of the empire, leading to more people becoming bilingual. Another important thing to understand is that the relationship between the Roman military and culture changed over time. During the Republic, things were simpler. Most soldiers came from Italy, and although they were sometimes sent abroad, their service usually didn't last more than a few years. In this period, the cultural impact of military service mainly affected Italian allies, people from different regions of Italy who had their own languages and customs. These allied units kept their own identity inside the army. Ancient writers even commented on their bravery or lack of it. For example, a unit from central Italy, the Paeligni, bravely attacked the Macedonian phalanx at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC. Military camps at the time also kept these allied units on the edges, which showed their separate status. While they probably used their native languages within their own units, they still needed to understand some Latin to work with the legions or with other allied troops from different regions. So, military life would still expose them to Roman language and customs, especially during daily activities like eating, shopping, or gambling, when soldiers from different backgrounds interacted. Later on, during the civil wars at the end of the Republic, many Italian allies were granted Roman citizenship. This helped them feel more connected to Rome and encouraged them to learn Latin. Then, when Augustus came to power, he created a standing army, and soldiers started serving for 20 years or more, often far from home. These soldiers were based in permanent camps near the empire's borders. Being away from their hometowns and in unfamiliar places helped build strong bonds between soldiers and made them feel like a part of something bigger, the Roman state. At the same time, Augustus began using more local troops from the provinces in the army instead of Italians. This made the army more diverse in culture and background. Still, all these soldiers, wherever they came from, were regularly involved in Roman religious ceremonies. One example is a Latin calendar found in Dura Europos, which lists traditional Roman festivals and honors to the emperor. These ceremonies weren't meant to force religion on soldiers, but rather to build loyalty to Rome and its leaders. However, Just by taking part in these events year after year, soldiers probably absorbed some Roman values and cultural habits without even realizing it. During the Principate, Roman soldiers didn't just take part in religious rituals, they were also introduced to important parts of Roman daily life, like public bathing. Even though some writers saw baths as a luxury that could weaken discipline, bathhouses became a normal part of military forts by the end of the 1st century. Big legionary camps usually had large bathhouses inside the walls, while smaller auxiliary forts had simpler ones outside. In fact, archaeologists have even found bath structures in remote places like the desert outposts in Egypt and North Africa, where water was very hard to find. This shows how important bathing was for Roman soldiers. What's even more interesting is that, as more provincial recruits joined the army and the number of Italians declined, these soldiers were introduced to Roman habits of hygiene and social life through these bathhouses. Of course, people outside Italy weren't unfamiliar with washing, but the Roman way of bathing, with its routines, spaces, and social rules, was something new that they learned in the army. Bathhouses were not just for cleaning. They were also places to socialize and relax. In fact, evidence like hairpins and children's teeth found in the drains of military baths shows that local civilians, not just soldiers, were also using these places, which helped spread Roman customs to nearby communities. Another Roman habit that soldiers from the provinces had to get used to was the diet. The army usually provided rations like wheat, olive oil, wine, meat, vegetables, cheese, and salt. For soldiers who came from Mediterranean regions, this food was pretty normal. But for those from northern provinces, like the areas near the Danube and Rhine, it was quite different. These northern areas didn't grow olives, so olive oil wasn't common there. People also preferred barley over wheat and drank beer instead of wine. Even though northern soldiers could still buy beer and barley locally, the army supplied and charged them for the standard rations, which gave them a reason to eat the Roman way. Over time, these soldiers likely got used to these new foods. And as soldiers adapted, so did the local communities around them. Although Rome didn't invent the Mediterranean diet, its soldiers helped spread it across the empire, and eating these foods likely became a part of what it meant to be Roman for many people. To provide olive oil to large numbers of Roman soldiers stationed in places like the Rhine, the Danube, and Britain, it was necessary to import the oil from southern parts of the empire. This is shown by the many oil containers, amphorae, found at military camps in the north. At first, this same method was used to bring in wheat and wine too. But unlike olive oil, wheat and wine could be produced more easily in northern climates. In fact, by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, many local farmers in the provinces had started growing wheat to meet the army's needs, and wine production grew a lot in Gaul during the 1st and 2nd centuries. These changes were clearly influenced by the army's demand, but they also began to change what local people ate and drank over time. Still, Roman food habits didn't spread in the same way everywhere. For example, when archaeologists studied animal bones from different parts of the Western Roman Empire, they noticed interesting differences. In Italy and southern Gaul, pork was the most common meat. In northern Gaul and along the Rhine, people mostly ate beef. In Britain, mutton was popular, but beef was also eaten a lot. When researchers looked at military camps in the Northwest, they found that soldiers mostly ate beef. This probably reflects the food habits of the local troops from northern Gaul and Germany who had joined the army. When some of these soldiers were later sent to Britain, they likely brought their food preferences with them, which may explain why beef was so common there. Because of this, one historian said that Roman Britain's food habits were partly Gallicized or Germanized. So, while Roman military service did spread some food traditions, it didn't completely replace local tastes. There were still limits to how much Roman food culture took hold in every region. There is clear evidence that many Roman soldiers continued to follow their native traditions, especially in areas like religion and burial, even while serving in the army. For example, a group of archers originally from Syrian Emesa who were stationed on the Danube kept worshipping their local god Elagabalus. Similarly, soldiers from a Tungrian cavalry unit posted in Scotland made offerings to gods from their homeland, Ricagambeda and Viradecthis. Palmyrene troops stationed in places like North Africa, Dacia, and Dura Europos also continued to honor their traditional gods, such as Malakbel and Iarhibol. In another case, at a site in Cumbria from the 3rd century, archaeologists found signs of burial customs that were very specific to the Danube region, including horse cremations and strange metal pendants buried with the dead. This suggests that soldiers from that area were still practicing their local funeral traditions. Another interesting aspect of Roman military culture in late antiquity was the rise of soldiers with barbarian backgrounds to high-ranking positions. In the early empire, top military commanders usually came from wealthy Roman families and often had both military and government careers. But by the 4th century, many generals were professional soldiers from humble origins, including a growing number of men from outside the empire. Some, like the Frankish general Silvanus and the half-Vandal Stilicho, were born in the empire to immigrant families and were likely more integrated into Roman society. Still, it's impressive that several of these men were made consuls, a title that no longer had power but was still highly respected because of its historic link to Rome's elite. These generals might not have had the same education as the Roman upper class, but they made efforts to fit into Roman cultural life. Some of them wrote letters to famous Roman intellectuals like Symmachus and the speaker Libanius. One general, Elibicus, even asked for copies of Libanius's speeches, while Stilicho supported the poet Claudian. Maybe their secretaries actually wrote the letters or read the speeches for them, and maybe the support of poets was a political move. But these actions still showed that they cared about Roman culture. Stilicho's daughters both married the emperor Honorius, and another general's daughter married Honorius's brother Arcadius. Her name was Eudoxia, a Greek-style name, which shows how deeply these families had adapted to Roman and even Greek culture. In his military manual, the Roman writer Vegetius explains how carefully the Roman army kept records of its daily operations. According to him, everything, discipline, duties, even finances, was written down in official records every day, sometimes even more carefully than government tax records. Soldiers took turns doing guard duty, and their names were recorded to make sure the work was shared fairly. Even when a soldier was given time off, it was noted in the lists, including how many days he was away. Although Vegetius was writing in a later period, and his information may not always match earlier times exactly, what he describes is confirmed by many documents found in places like Roman Egypt and Dura Europos. These documents, written on papyrus, broken pottery, or wooden tablets, show how the army managed itself and give us valuable insight into how things really worked behind the scenes, something we can't always get from traditional historical books, which often use dramatic language. However, we need to be careful not to jump to conclusions. Just because we find lots of written records doesn't mean the Roman army was a modern-style bureaucracy or that most soldiers were literate. These documents mostly come from regions that became part of the empire after Augustus, like Egypt and Mesopotamia, so they mainly reflect the way the army worked during the Principate and later, not the earlier Republic. Other sources from places like Britain or North Africa also date from later periods. For the Republican period, we mostly rely on short mentions in historical writings, many of which were actually written during the Principate and might reflect that later reality rather than the Republic. Still, we do have some clues. In the Republic, officials called censors kept lists of citizens, partly to see who could be called for military service. These were not military records exactly, since they were made for taxes and other civil duties too. But writers like Polybius do mention that army commanders kept lists of soldiers who joined specific campaigns, and that guards on night duty received written instructions. Another historian, Appian, says that during the late Republic, officers kept records of soldiers' behavior and reported daily troop numbers. Though he lived in the 2nd century, his account might still reflect earlier practices. Altogether, these examples show that even before the Principate, the Roman army used written documents in important ways, laying the foundation for the more detailed record-keeping we see in later centuries. It's not surprising that ordinary daily tasks, like paperwork, aren't often mentioned in old Roman writings. But after Augustus created a permanent, professional army, the need for detailed military records clearly grew. For example, soldiers had to serve for many years to earn their discharge payments, so records had to track how long they had served. Leave requests and permissions also had to be recorded, especially with soldiers staying in one place for longer periods in permanent forts. This led to more structured and varied types of record-keeping. By the 2nd century, we know there were different kinds of military clerks, some in charge of food supplies, some managing soldiers' savings, and others keeping track of soldiers who died without heirs. Surviving documents include lists, letters, duty rosters, reports, and even daybooks that recorded the details of mail sent between forts. These documents help us understand how the Roman army used written records to maintain control. Things like duty rosters and strength reports allowed commanders to know where every soldier was, which helped them control large regions with only a small number of troops. Even personal letters sent by soldiers to friends and family were organized through the army and may have helped boost morale. However, despite all this paperwork, we shouldn't assume the Roman army was as organized as a modern-day military. We haven't found a full file for any individual soldier that includes their entire career. Things like enlistment papers, promotions, leave records, or discharge documents all in one place. There were also differences in how paperwork was done across the empire. While Latin was the main language of military documents, Greek was also used in the eastern provinces. The format of documents like leave requests could vary depending on the region. Those found in Britain weren't exactly the same as those found in Egypt. Even if the Roman army didn't have a fully consistent bureaucracy, soldiers were clearly much more exposed to reading and writing than most ordinary people in the Roman world, especially farmers in the countryside, who made up most of the population. This has led scholars to wonder whether Roman soldiers were generally more literate than average people. One example from the late 2nd century gives us a clue. In a cavalry unit, 2/3 of the soldiers couldn't sign for a hay delivery themselves and had to ask a more literate comrade to write it for them. Still, we can't generalize too much from this. It's important to remember that literacy likely varied between officers and regular soldiers, and also between legionaries and auxiliaries. Officers in the Roman army were generally expected to be literate. Most came from social backgrounds where reading and writing were common. Even those who didn't start out in elite Roman society, like Cerealis, a commander from northern Gaul, could still read and write well in Latin. Some officers, like centurions, had already been literate before joining, especially those from higher social classes. But others, who worked their way up through the ranks, likely learned to read and write while serving in the army. In fact, a few even tried writing poetry, though not always successfully. Other lower-ranking officers, like optiones, were also probably literate, based on written reports they left behind and artistic depictions of them holding writing tablets. Some experts think that about 10% of soldiers in a legion had roles that required literacy. In the later Roman period, writings like the Strategicon show that mid-level officers were expected to read and write, and orders were commonly given in writing. As for ordinary soldiers, there's some evidence that more of them were literate than we might assume, especially considering most came from rural areas. For example, during the civil wars of the late Republic, commanders used written messages, like leaflets shot into enemy camps or passed out secretly, to try to win over enemy troops. These efforts wouldn't have worked if no one could read them, so there must have been some soldiers who could read the material aloud to their comrades. Roman laws were also often posted in military camps. This included laws that affected soldiers directly, like Hadrian's law about soldiers' children, or benefits granted by emperors like Licinius. These texts were sometimes displayed near the military standards, possibly as symbols, but also in places where soldiers would see them often. The assumption seems to have been that literate soldiers would read these notices to others. Even if many soldiers couldn't read, just seeing written texts posted around the camp helped make the written word a normal part of military life. At a fort in Bungem, North Africa, for example, the outside wall of a building was used like a public notice board. Although only fragments survive, the writing seems to have shared local news with soldiers. Some documents show that even lower-ranking soldiers could write. For instance, hay receipts from a cavalry unit show that about a third of the soldiers could sign their names, while others had someone else write for them. We also have a detailed report written by a regular cavalryman on a piece of pottery, and several leave requests from Vindolanda, each in a different handwriting, suggesting they were written by ordinary soldiers. Even the fact that 20% of surviving inkwells were found at military sites supports the idea that writing was part of everyday army life. Vegetius, a Roman military writer, said that being able to read and write might be one of the things considered when choosing new soldiers. But could regular soldiers actually learn to read and write while serving in the army? One text from the Roman period mentions that there were army clerks who were able to teach others, but most historians don't think the Roman military officially taught literacy as part of training. If a soldier wanted to learn, he probably had to do it on his own, maybe with help from a fellow soldier in his tent who already knew how. Still, there were good reasons to learn. Jobs in the army that required reading and writing often came with better conditions, like being excused from hard physical duties, and they gave soldiers a better chance at promotion and higher pay. Even beyond that, just seeing how useful reading and writing could be, like using written letters to get favors from powerful people, helped encourage soldiers and those around them to value literacy and want to learn it themselves. In the ancient world, war happened in many different ways, but modern people often picture big, dramatic battles between armies as the main form of fighting. This idea likely comes from popular histories that focus on decisive battles, and also from ancient historians like Herodotus, who described famous battles like Marathon and Plataea in detail. Because of these old stories, modern historians have often made battles the center of their research into ancient warfare. However, the questions historians ask today are different from those in the past. Before trying to learn from ancient battle stories, it's important to understand how they were written. Even though ancient authors claimed to tell the truth, they were also writing for entertainment, so they followed certain storytelling traditions. These included common features like speeches before battles, arrows darkening the sky, and soldiers slipping in blood. Writers were influenced by older works, especially Homer's epics, and historians like Herodotus and Thucydides. Describing battles gave them a chance to show off their writing skills and entertain readers. That means many of the battle accounts we have are full of cliches or dramatic filler, and we shouldn't assume they're completely accurate, even if the writer had some military experience. which was rare. Thankfully, we also have other kinds of evidence, like weapons, armor, and some texts that are more straightforward, that help us better understand how ancient battles really worked. One such source will be explored more at the end of this section. One common way people have studied Roman battles is by trying to figure out how the armies were arranged, how they moved, and what tactics they used. Basically, trying to explain why one side won and the other lost. This approach makes sense and has sometimes been used in military schools to learn lessons from history, even though ancient battles were very different from modern ones because of the lack of advanced technology. This kind of study usually focuses on the commanders and their decisions. That's fine, as long as we remember the problems with the sources, like the fact that ancient writers followed literary traditions and that nobody could really know everything that happened in the middle of a chaotic battle. However, over the last 40 years, another way of studying battles has become more popular. This new method is called the face of battle approach. It became well known after John Keegan's book, The Face of Battle, published in 1976. Instead of focusing on generals, this approach looks at what it was like for the ordinary soldier in the front lines. It has influenced the way we look at ancient warfare too, not just medieval or modern battles. The face of battle idea can mean different things, but it always tries to understand the experience of regular soldiers. One part of this is studying how the actual fighting worked. In his book, Keegan broke down combat into different matchups, like archers versus cavalry, or infantry versus infantry. Some historians have used this idea to look at Roman battles, especially since Roman heavy infantry played such an important role. For example, historian Philip Sabin looked closely at Roman infantry fighting and noticed that battles often lasted over an hour. One side usually lost more soldiers than the other. The front lines moved during battle, and soldiers in the back rows also played a role. From this, he suggested that Roman battles weren't just two groups pushing against each other, like in some Greek battles. Instead, Roman infantry fighting was more like a back-and-forth exchange, with moments of intense close combat and periods of standing off. This also shows that Roman units had to be flexible and work well in smaller groups. People have reacted differently to modern models of how Roman battles worked. Some agree with the more flexible style of fighting described by Sabin, because archaeological finds and images of Roman soldiers seem to support it. This model suggests that Roman infantry didn't just stand still and push, but instead fought in a more open back-and-forth way. However, others argue that this model doesn't consider how dangerous it was if the front line broke, especially when enemy cavalry attacked. Some also say it doesn't fully consider the role of missile weapons, like spears or arrows. Battle tactics also changed over time. In late antiquity, for example, new enemies like horse archers forced the Romans to adapt. Infantry still played an important role but became more defensive, using tighter formations and more types of missiles, while cavalry took on more offensive roles by the 500s. Another area influenced by John Keegan's ideas is the question of morale, why Roman soldiers were willing to fight and risk death. Keegan looked at soldiers' letters and diaries from battles like Waterloo and the Somme to understand what they felt. Ancient historians don't have this kind of evidence, but one rare example is the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who was actually in the siege of Amida in 359. Still, he was an officer and wrote his account much later. So, to understand morale in Roman battles, historians rely on indirect evidence like the promise of rewards or punishments, good training, and leadership. Some even try comparing Roman soldiers to modern ones, though that can be risky because it assumes that people in all times and cultures react the same way in battle. A big debate has come from the ideas of Marshall, a U.S. Army historian. He claimed that most modern soldiers didn't actually try to kill the enemy in combat. He believed this was because society teaches people that killing is wrong, so fear of fighting is a natural emotion. According to his research, only about 25% of American soldiers in World War II actually fired their weapons with the intent to kill. He also said that what helped soldiers fight better was being part of a close group. If a soldier knew the men around him and cared about what they thought, he would be more likely to fight because he didn't want to lose respect. This idea of small group bonding helping soldiers overcome fear has become important in military history discussions. There has been a lot of debate about L.A. Marshall's claim that only about 25% of American soldiers in World War II actually fired their weapons to kill. The biggest problem is that his research methods were not very reliable. It turns out he probably didn't interview as many soldiers as he said, and many of those soldiers later said they weren't even asked if they had fired their weapons. Even though some people still find his ideas interesting, many others have pointed out these problems. Still, some historians have used Marshall's conclusions when thinking about Roman soldiers, without really questioning whether they apply. But ancient Roman soldiers were very different from modern ones. Roman culture didn't have the same moral rules against killing, especially not before Christianity became influential in the later Roman Empire. In fact, Romans grew up seeing a lot of violence. Religious ceremonies often involved killing animals, and gladiator games, public executions, and even cockfighting were common. Children grew up seeing blood and violence regularly. That said, this doesn't mean Roman soldiers weren't afraid in battle. Ancient weapons could cause terrible injuries, even with armor, and many battle stories show that Roman soldiers felt fear and anxiety. Some modern writers have even wondered if Roman soldiers suffered from PTSD, but that's hard to prove. Their world was so different, both culturally and technologically, that it's difficult to compare. What's clear, though, is that keeping morale high was very important in the Roman army. In this sense, Marshall's idea that strong bonds between small groups of soldiers helped them stay brave still seems relevant when thinking about Roman warfare. Some historians have criticized Marshall's idea that strong bonds within small groups are the main reason soldiers fight. One problem is that this idea doesn't explain what happens when a unit suffers many losses in a short time. For example, during World War II, some German and American units had to take in lots of new soldiers very quickly. These replacements didn't survive long enough to build friendships or become buddies, and often their fellow soldiers didn't even learn their names. But this situation doesn't apply as much to ancient battles, where most of the killing happened after the battle was already lost, during the retreat or rout. In the Roman army, group unity was likely stronger and more stable. Soldiers lived and fought closely in small teams called a contubernium, 8 men sharing a tent, and larger units called a century. These close bonds were important for keeping morale high and fighting effectively. Even if terms like contubernales, tent mates, or commilitones, fellow soldiers, in inscriptions need careful interpretation, Roman sources do show that trust and friendship among soldiers mattered. Caesar, for example, mentions that before battle, soldiers often encouraged each other by reminding their tent mates to fight bravely and live up to their reputation. Some scholars argue that ancient writers talk more about rivalry than friendship among soldiers. But this competition often worked with group unity, not against it. Soldiers who acted bravely often inspired others to do the same, either to keep up or avoid shame. Another modern approach to studying battle looks at unpredictability. It's obvious that battles don't always go as planned, but this idea has been explored in more detail using something called chaos theory. This theory, taken from math and science, says that in complex systems, small changes can lead to big effects, like the idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in one place could eventually cause a tornado somewhere else. Applied to battle, It means that war is messy and unpredictable. One small event or mistake can change everything, and effects can build on each other in unexpected ways. Historians have noticed that writers like Livy often describe battles turning because of small events. This way of thinking supports the idea that what happens on the front lines, the experience of ordinary soldiers, matters just as much, if not more, than the decisions made by command. A very useful example of how unpredictable Roman battles could be, and what fighting in one really felt like, comes from a rare and valuable eyewitness account. The battle happened on April 14th, 43 BC, near a village called Forum Gallorum in northern Italy. It took place during the power struggles that followed Julius Caesar's assassination. At the time, Mark Antony was attacking Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's killers, who was hiding in the city of Mutina. One of the Roman consuls, Hirtius, came north with an army to help Brutus, but waited to fight until the other consul, Pansa, could arrive with more troops. Pansa's army had 4 legions, but they were mostly new and inexperienced soldiers. Antony tried to take advantage of this by attacking Pansa's troops before they could join Hirtius. What makes this battle special for historians is that, along with the usual historical texts, we also have a letter written the very next day by an officer named Galba. He wrote to Cicero, giving his version of what happened. While Galba clearly wanted to make himself look good and downplay his side's losses, the fact that he was there and wrote immediately after the battle makes it a rare and important source. Galba's letter gives us insight into what it was like for officers in battle. First, it shows how hard it was to get clear information during the fight. Antony attacked, thinking he was only fighting inexperienced soldiers, not knowing that Hirtius had secretly sent one of his best legions, the Martian Legion, along with 2 elite units to help Pansa. This meant Antony faced much stronger resistance than he expected. Second, Galba shows how hard it was to control the troops. When Antony's army showed up near Forum Gallorum, the Martian Legion charged forward on their own, without waiting for orders. Galba says they couldn't stop them. The less experienced soldiers were forced to follow behind, unprepared. The Martian Legion was especially eager to fight because they wanted revenge. Some of their officers had been killed by Antony the year before. This example highlights how unpredictable and chaotic battles could be in the Roman world, especially when soldiers acted on emotion rather than orders. A third problem during the battle was that the different parts of Pansa's army had trouble staying coordinated. Galba was helping command 8 cohorts from the experienced Martian Legion on the right side of the army. They pushed back one of Antony's legions so far that Galba and his men ended up more than half a mile ahead of the rest of the army. This left them vulnerable and at risk of being surrounded by Antony's cavalry. As Galba tried to fix this by riding back, he ran into a fourth problem. He almost got killed by his own side. He galloped toward some of the new recruits, but they thought he was the enemy and nearly threw their spears at him. Only at the last second did they realize who he was. This kind of confusion was more likely in a civil war, where both sides were Roman and looked alike. Meanwhile, Antony's forces tried to capture Pansa's camp, but failed. He still thought he had won the battle, until he returned to Forum Gallorum and was surprised by a group of Hirtius' experienced troops coming from the main road. These veterans caused major losses to Antony's army and even captured 2 legionary eagles and 60 military standards. This second phase of the battle again shows how hard it was to keep track of everything happening during such chaos. Galba's letter, written right after the fight, tells us what it was like for officers during the battle. But it doesn't talk much about emotions or what the regular soldiers went through. It focuses on movement, decisions, and outcomes, showing how Roman officers could still feel proud of victory even when fighting against other Romans. To get a better idea of what the common soldiers experienced, we can also look at a different account by the historian Appian. He wrote about this battle 200 years later, but he seems to have used reliable sources. In his version, he describes a brutal and disciplined fight between Antony's troops and the Martian legion in a narrow area surrounded by marshes. Because they couldn't move around much, the soldiers fought in close quarters with swords, like in a wrestling match. Every strike hit someone. There was no shouting, just the sounds of men getting wounded and dying. When someone fell, he was quickly replaced. The soldiers didn't need orders. They knew what to do from experience. When they got tired, they rested for a few seconds like in training, then jumped back into the fight. When new recruits arrived and saw this, they were amazed at how calm and organized the fighting was. The battle by Appian may include some exaggeration, and it's unlikely that soldiers really had organized rest breaks during such intense combat. Still, it gives us a vivid sense of what close hand-to-hand fighting must have felt like for experienced Roman soldiers. Of course, this was just one battle, and it's hard to draw broad conclusions from it, especially since it took place during a civil war. Even in battles against non-Roman enemies, the details would have changed depending on who the Romans were fighting and when in history the battle occurred, since the Roman military itself evolved over time. The kind of soldier someone was, heavy infantry, light skirmisher, archer, or cavalry, also shaped their experience in battle. Still, Galba's account is very valuable because it gives us a rare look at what battle was like during an important time in Roman history. Just like soldiers, people who weren't in the army also experienced war in different ways, depending on where and when they lived. In the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, most of Rome's wars were fought in Italy, directly affecting many towns and communities. But in the 2nd century BC, as Rome expanded, most wars were fought in foreign lands, so life in Italy was more peaceful. Later, during the Social War and the Civil Wars at the end of the Republic, war once again returned to Italy and affected other parts of the empire like Spain, southern Gaul, and the Balkans. During the early empire, most wars happened near the borders, although civil wars like the one in 68 to 69 AD did affect northern Italy. Some revolts, like in Judea and Britain, brought heavy fighting to places that weren't near the borders. In the 3rd century, many provinces in the north and east experienced attacks from outside forces, and this continued in the 4th century. Italy was sometimes caught up in civil wars too. In the 5th century, nearly every part of the empire saw war, except, somewhat surprisingly, the eastern provinces. Persia had its own problems, so that area stayed more peaceful for a while. But in the 6th and early 7th centuries, war returned to the east, and Justinian's military campaigns in the west brought long-lasting battles to Italy and North Africa again. Civilians usually came closest to war during sieges, and we have a lot of evidence about how they were affected. Most of the time, civilians stayed behind the walls with the military forces, so they weren't always directly fighting. But since sieges often lasted a long time and targeted entire cities, they had serious effects on everyone inside, including women and children. Stories about sieges were popular in ancient literature, often inspired by the famous tale of Troy. So just like battle stories, many ancient siege accounts were written in a dramatic and traditional style. Still, we have some very detailed and reliable accounts written by people who were actually there, like Caesar's report on Alesia, Josephus on Jerusalem, and Ammianus on Amida. Later on, Procopius wrote about the siege of Rome in 537, and a unique Syriac chronicle tells us about the sieges in Mesopotamia around 502. These kinds of sources help us understand the real impact of sieges. Life during a siege was hard for civilians. Men who weren't soldiers might be asked to guard the walls or gates. Sometimes specific groups like monks, Jews, or even young men from local social clubs were given this job, maybe because they were thought to be more loyal to each other. In Rome, during the Gothic siege of 537, civilians were even paid to do guard duty because there were so many walls to cover. These people could end up in real combat during attacks. There are examples of civilians fighting beside soldiers, like in Edessa in 544. Women and children were also involved in some sieges. They helped carry supplies to the walls and even poured boiling oil on attackers. Some helped make weapons or donated their hair to fix catapults. In one case, during the war with Hannibal, the women of a town fought alongside the men and were praised for being just as brave. But the biggest problems in a siege were hunger and disease. Cutting off food was a key tactic used by attackers to break the defenders' spirit and cause unrest in the city. The people inside often tried to survive by getting rid of those who couldn't fight, like slaves or other non-combatants. Some ate animals like mice, plants, or even tree bark when things got really bad. In rare and desperate situations, some cities even resorted to cannibalism. Disease also became a huge issue because of poor hygiene and the difficulty of burying the dead. This happened in many cities, like Athens, Syracuse, and Rome. On top of all this, hunger and illness weakened the community's unity. Soldiers and civilians started to blame each other, and different groups fought among themselves. In some cases, like in the town of Tella, this led to violence, with attacks on minority groups such as the Jews. When an army managed to capture a city after a long siege, the results were usually terrible for the people living inside. The longer the siege lasted, the more the attacking soldiers suffered. And when they finally broke through, they often took revenge. It was very difficult for commanders to control their soldiers once they entered the city. Ancient writers, influenced by famous stories like the fall of Troy, often described these moments with strong emotion and drama. But even without these literary exaggerations, archaeology confirms how brutal these attacks could be. For example, in the 1990s, archaeologists digging in Valencia, Spain, discovered shocking evidence from when Pompey's army took the city in 75 BC. Every building from that time had been destroyed, and nothing was rebuilt for more than 100 years. Even worse, they found the remains of about 13 men, many with signs of torture, tied or cut off hands, ropes around their necks, and even one man who had been impaled on a spear. These brutal killings likely had a political reason, since Spain at the time was caught in a violent civil war. Throughout Roman history, many sources mention cities where the local people were slaughtered after the Romans, or sometimes their enemies, won. This happened at places like Cremona in AD 69 and Amida in 503. Sometimes the attackers made a difference between men of fighting age and women or children, but often everyone was at risk. Those who weren't killed were usually enslaved, which became one of the main ways the Romans gathered slaves. This was especially common during the Republic, when Rome was still expanding and fighting many wars. In the later Principate period, there were fewer wars, so mass enslavements were not as common, but they still happened. For example, the Jewish War in the 1st century led to the capture of many towns, and each time, mass enslavement followed. During late antiquity, the Roman Empire continued to enslave people from cities it captured, especially along the eastern frontier. In areas like northern Mesopotamia and Armenia, where there were more towns, Roman emperors such as Constantius II, Julian, and Maurice took many prisoners and moved them to other parts of the empire to work and settle. However, it wasn't only the Romans doing this. Sometimes their own cities were attacked, and their people were taken as slaves. The Persians were particularly interested in capturing Roman citizens and relocating them to Persian territory, where they were used for labor on farms and building projects. This practice started around the mid-200s AD and continued for several centuries. While northern tribes like the Goths and Franks weren't usually good at siege warfare, some groups like the Huns and Avars were more effective. In the 440s, the Huns attacked many cities in the Balkans, capturing large amounts of treasure and many people. Later, in the 580s, the Avars also attacked cities like Singidunum and carried away the population into slavery. In one rare case, we actually know what happened to a man who was captured. He had been a merchant in a Roman city but became a slave of a Hun noble. Over time, he fought bravely in battles, gained wealth, and was set free. He married a local woman, started a family, and chose to stay in the Hun kingdom, enjoying life more than under Roman rule with its taxes and corruption. However, such happy endings were rare. Most prisoners likely faced harsh conditions. A more typical image of the cruelty of war can be found in an unusual place, a poem about sea life written in the 2nd century. The poet Oppian compares the violence among sea creatures to human battles. In one part, he describes a scene where an eel tries to pull an octopus off a rock. He compares it to a city being captured, where soldiers drag away children clinging to their mothers. The image is vivid. A child won't let go of his mother, and she won't let go of him, but both are pulled away. In this way, the poet captures the heartbreak and violence of war and slavery, showing how deeply it affected families. One of the most terrible and common things that happened after a city was captured was the sexual abuse of women and children. This was a regular part of war throughout history. Although many old stories, like the fall of Troy in Homer's epics, helped turn this into a common theme in literature, these events were very real. Sexual violence in war was not just about desire. It was often used by soldiers to show power and humiliate their enemies, especially by attacking the enemy's families. In Roman times, we hear about this in different ways. Some writers mention it directly during sieges. Others praise generals for avoiding it. And sometimes women killed themselves rather than be taken. There are even sling bullets from a siege that have threats of rape written on them. Another way civilians suffered during Roman warfare was through raids. Raids were smaller attacks, not big battles or long sieges, so they aren't described as often in ancient texts. Sometimes Rome used raids to hurt or weaken enemies, or had its allies do the same. But more often, enemies of Rome used raids to attack the empire, since most of them didn't have big enough armies to fight in open battle. The Roman Empire was rich, which made it an attractive target for raiders. Some raids were small. For example, in the year 118, a report written on a piece of pottery tells how 60 raiders attacked a Roman station in Egypt and kidnapped a woman and 2 children. But other raids were much bigger. One Roman monument celebrates a victory over a huge group of Germanic tribes who had raided northern Italy in 260. When they were caught heading home, they had thousands of Italian prisoners with them, showing just how large and dangerous some raids could be. Sometimes, when Roman soldiers were away fighting elsewhere, civilians had to protect themselves from raiders. For example, in the 1700s, while Roman troops were busy with the Marcomannic War, tribes called the Kostoboci raided parts of Greece. A former Olympic athlete gathered men from his city, Elatea, to fight back. Other cities like Thespiae and Athens may have done the same. In later centuries, this kind of civilian defense became more common. In 260, locals helped Roman soldiers stop Germanic raiders carrying many prisoners. In another case, around 270, a historian named Dexippus led 2,000 Athenian citizens to fight invaders after Athens had already been attacked. Even older people, like the famous General Belisarius, led last-minute defenses using regular people alongside trained soldiers. But not all of these efforts worked. At Adrianople in 376, armed civilians tried to fight off Gothic raiders but were badly defeated. Raids often targeted people. Capturing civilians to turn them into slaves was very common. We see this in many examples, like women and children taken in Egypt in 118, or the thousands of Italians captured in 260. Gothic sea raiders took people from northern Anatolia. Desert raiders grabbed peasants from farms in Africa, and nearly 20,000 people were taken from Mesopotamia in 502. One of the most detailed stories comes from the life of a monk named Malchus. He was captured by Arab raiders near Nisibis and forced to work as a shepherd in the desert. His master tried to make him start a family with another captive, but Malchus refused because of his Christian beliefs. Eventually they escaped, and he returned to the empire and became a monk again. His story is rare because it's the only real slave story we know from the Roman world. Another piece of evidence comes from the Rhine River in Germany. There, archaeologists found hundreds of objects taken from Roman homes: coins, dishes, weapons, and more. These were likely being carried home by raiders, probably in wagons. But among the items, they also found shackles, showing that people were being taken too. It's unclear what happened, but it seems the wagons sank in the river, either because they were too heavy or the water was too strong. Sadly, rescuing the prisoners probably wasn't a concern for the raiders. Another kind of warfare that had a big effect on civilians was long-lasting or protracted war. These wars, which lasted more than 10 years in the same area, were rare in ancient times because it was hard to keep armies supplied for that long. But when they did happen, they often caused serious damage to local farming and the rural economy. Two well-known examples are the Hannibalic War in Italy during the late 200s BC and the Gothic War in the 500s AD. The impact of the Hannibalic War has been debated. For a while, some historians believed the damage wasn't too bad, but later studies argued that southern Italy suffered heavily. Even though invading armies couldn't always destroy crops or trees, just their presence in the area could stop farmers from planting or harvesting. Small farmers were hit hardest. Losing one year's harvest or farming tools could ruin them forever. Many families had to flee to cities and never returned to their farms. The Gothic War lasted even longer than the Hannibalic War and caused widespread destruction, though it's talked about less. At first, the empire quickly gained ground, but after new commanders took over, the war dragged on for more than 10 more years. During that time, central Italy was hit hard by famine and war. A historian named Procopius claimed that tens of thousands starved in one region. Although he may have exaggerated to criticize the emperor, other evidence backs up the serious impact of the war. Letters from Pope Pelagius said that farming had collapsed and the church's income dropped sharply. Archaeologists have found signs that many farms and villas were abandoned. One old legal document even mentions that land and slaves were donated to the church in Ravenna, and it talks about trying to recover slaves who ran away during the chaos. This shows that war didn't always create slaves. In this case, it caused them to escape, which made farming even harder. Warfare was a major part of Roman history and had a strong effect on how the Roman state developed over more than 1,000 years. It also affected the many peoples and countries Rome fought against. The role of war changed depending on how big the Roman state was and how strong its enemies were at different times, so it's hard to make simple conclusions. Still, it's clear that war played a key role in Roman history. For much of its history, Rome was successful in war. Even though there were losses, Rome usually defeated its enemies and gained new land. War helped Rome get resources like money, goods, and people. One of the most common results of Roman victories was taking large numbers of people as slaves. They also took wealth from conquered places and began taxing new provinces. Over time, as Rome took over less developed areas, especially in Western Europe, these regions slowly developed cities and were brought into Rome's wider economy. The taxes from these new regions helped pay for the Roman army, which was the state's biggest expense. Rome also used local people from the provinces in its army. Many of them served in auxiliary units, and during their service, they learned Latin and Roman customs. Some even gained Roman citizenship. This helped pull different parts of the empire closer together. But this process worked both ways. The new provinces also influenced Roman culture. As the empire expanded, the idea of what it meant to be Roman started to change. War also helped change how the Roman government worked. For example, after Rome gained an empire in the 2nd century BC, competition between powerful Roman leaders became more intense. This helped lead to civil wars in the 1st century BC. The wars fought by Pompey in the east and Caesar in Gaul were key steps in this process. These civil wars eventually led to the rise of Augustus and a new system where one man held most of the power. Augustus also made big changes to the army, creating a permanent standing force stationed at the empire's borders. This helped him stay in control, but also changed many things, like government finances and life in the provinces. In the 3rd century AD, Rome faced a lot of chaos and crisis. War was a big reason for this. Many emperors came from the army, and the government had to change to deal with new military problems, especially threats from the east and north. One major change in this period was the fall of the Parthian Empire and the rise of the stronger, more aggressive Sasanian Empire in Persia. The Sasanians took over in the 220s, partly because Rome had invaded Mesopotamia many times in the previous century, weakening the Parthian rulers. So in many ways, war shaped not only Rome's borders, but its politics, society, economy, and identity. Looking at Roman history from the Republic to late antiquity helps us see some key things that stayed the same over time. One of them was the strong belief in victory. This idea was deeply rooted in Roman culture. Even when the empire faced defeats later on, showing off power and success in war was still important. Also, the old idea of the citizen soldier remained popular, even though by the year 212, all free people in the empire had been given Roman citizenship, so it didn't mean as much anymore. However, things also changed. Once emperors were in control, they didn't want other elite Romans gaining too much military fame. Because of this, peace started to be seen as a good thing, more than it was during the Republic. Also, the Roman virtue of virtus, which used to mean bravery in battle, started to mean more general qualities like loyalty and service to the emperor. One of the biggest changes in late antiquity was the rise of Christianity, which became supported by the emperors starting in the early 300s. But even though Christianity taught peace and compassion, it didn't really change how wars were fought. Wars still happened, soldiers still hurt civilians, and while peace talks became more common, that was mostly because they were necessary, not because people had suddenly become more peaceful. Military traditions mostly stayed the same, just with Christian symbols replacing the old Roman gods. One new, but not very positive development was that religion started to be used as a reason to go to war, especially in the 500s and 600s. Still, Christianity did bring one good change. Church leaders like bishops often helped people during wartime. They kept people's spirits up during sieges, gave food to the hungry, and even helped buy the freedom of prisoners. This kind of help from the church was something new in Roman history and made a real difference in how some communities survived the hardships of war.